Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last academic lecture. This will be 11.1 through 11.3 if you're looking to take notes on the note sheets. We're going to be talking about the Bush presidency, and we're going to get all the way up to Obama, I believe. And then we will go from there. Um, but let's get into it because this will be basically the last academic lecture, and I want to get this done so I can post it and you guys can get onto it. So, without further ado, the Bush presidency, 1989 to 1983. Okay, President George H.W. Bush, he served two terms as Reagan's vice president before being elected outright as my, my wife's listening to her earphones and singing at her desk. But anyway, we'll keep going. A little levity there at the beginning of the presentation here. But President Bush was the President Bush was the resume candidate for presidency right here because he had had dramatic experience in foreign affairs. He was a former congressman. He was also a former chairman of the Republican Party, a former director of the CIA, and he, as Reagan's vice president, he seemed like the shoe-in candidate, just basically on experience alone for the presidency. But he does some things that are very curious. He picks an absolute doofus, in my opinion, Dan Quayle, who is on the surface not a bad guy, but he's just, I think, politically immature and he picks Dan Quayle as his running mate, which I think was mistake one. Uh, and then he, issues his famous "Read My Lips, No New Taxes" thing that we'll talk about later. But he basically shoots himself in the foot right out of the starting gate. Uh, but Bush, he had experience in foreign affairs, but as you'll see as we develop this, he faced a lot of challenges on the home front, and the domestic agenda would be his undoing. And this is due in part to the military spending during the Reagan years, because it basically meant less spending on domestic projects. And you also have higher taxes at this point. You have a swollen budget deficit. And these problems have to be corrected, or they will lead to further economic problems down the road. Bush is put into a position to where he says that he won't raise taxes, but soon he will not have a choice. So let's talk about Bush's domestic policy. Now, Bush had the unfortunate situation of leading the country into an economy that was starting to go into a recession. Economically, whatever goes up will eventually come down. And you see this start to occur during Bush's tenure. You have reduced government spending and reduced government spending by businesses, or reduced spending by businesses, and reduced consumer spending. And then this causes an ebb in consumer confidence. This causes a decrease in demand for consumer goods. People are starting to become very concerned about the direction the economy is going. And as you start to see an economy that was cooking with just nuclear steam start to slow down. Okay. You also see a rise in foreign competition. As our relationship with China starts to grow, a lot of our steel production that had gone on in the Rust Belt in the upper Northeast and the central portion of the country, a lot of that industry is shifted to being produced in China now because it's cheaper to produce in China. And foreign competition leads to even less demand for American products. You see the rise in the Japanese auto industry, for example. That's providing stiff competition for automobile retailers in America. And this is resulting in layoffs in very important industries. Now, states in the Northeast also begin losing people as people leave the Northeast looking for work. And this creates the Rust Belt, the rust implying decay. And this leads to a very interesting thesis on the impact of geography on history. Now, until the 1970s, in the early formation of America, most Americans lived in the Northeast and the Midwest. Those were the major population centers. You had fairly typical, typical weather. You had hot summers, you had cold winters, and the Southeast was considered far too hot, far too humid, while the west of the country was considered dry, harsh, and remote, and there just simply was not a lot of population out that way. But technology starts to change this. The government in the 50s, they build the interstate highway system under Eisenhower. That changes the way, not only the way we travel, but the way we conduct commerce. Uh, America becomes more connected then. You also have an increase in the building of infrastructure like dams, which affords the opportunity for a lot of these arid lands to get water and irrigation. People start growing crops in different places. And air conditioning, one of the greatest inventions ever. As you know, I am a big fan of air conditioning, and it makes it possible for people to keep cool in the South. I don't know what we'd do here without air conditioning. Thank God for air conditioning. But you combine a deteriorating economy with the rise in new technology, and suddenly people start leaving the Rust Belt and the decaying cities. A lot of these cities, like Detroit, with the deterioration of the auto industry, uh, a lot of people leave these areas, and these cities start to decay, and they leave for the Sun Belt. So you see a shift in population that was due in large part to the geography of those regions. Okay, and here's the Rust Belt up here, the Great Lakes region, Pennsylvania, and then here's the Sun Belt, what's considered the Sun Belt. You have Florida, Texas, Arizona, California. All right, so let's talk about Bush's domestic policy. Civil rights and civil unrest would be a problem during the Bush administration, namely with the LA riots. Now, the progress that had been made in the 60s and the 70s was very real and very palpable, but you had a two pronged problem here. The recession hits young African Americans very hard. Minorities in harsh economic times tend to suffer more than any other group. And what you have with a recession is an increase in crime, also an increase in drug use. You have the crack cocaine epidemic that is starting to spread like wildfire in the inner cities. And an African American gentleman named Rodney King is speeding on the LA freeway. He attracts the attention of the cops. He's high on crack cocaine. The cops go to pull him over. He resists arrest, and they basically subdue him with, excuse me, with heavy force. Well, what occurs is that this is videotaped, and it is videotaped and released to the media. As such, this draws the ire of minorities in the Crenshaw district, in South Central LA, in East LA as well. And what this does, because these cops are brought to trial, not in LA, but I believe Glendale in California, and they're found not guilty before an all white jury. And this leads to an explosion in violence. However, but Bush does do some really good things. He passes the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is signed by President Bush, and this prohibits discrimination against the disabled in employment and in public facilities. If you ever go into a business and you see a walkway for wheelchairs, a ramp for wheelchairs. This requires that businesses actually install these things so as to not discriminate against people with disabilities in employment. And this is a good thing. So, this was a signature element for the American with Disabilities Act, was a signature development of the Bush administration, and a good thing. All right, moving on. Come on. Okay. So the New World Order. So the Cold War is now over, and the U.S. is wanting to create a world based on democracy, upon free market capitalism, Western culture. This sort of cultural diffusion. If you remember cultural diffusion, instead of there being distinctions, there is this development of a culturally diffuse, homogenized world where Western culture free market capitalism is the rule of the day. And Bush, openly says, this is a new world order now. However, the end of the Cold War will not mean the end of war or the end of problems, as we're going to find out here very shortly. The U.S. In the 90s, at home, we see a huge amount of problems at home. There's terrorism abroad. Ethnic strife in the Balkans starts to become a reality, and in the Middle East. But the U.S., as the peacekeeper of the world, starts to try and become the world police and get involved to ensure that this cultural diffusion does go forward. All right, Operation Desert Storm, known as the Persian Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War. Now, we know in 88, Ronald Reagan's VP, George H.W. Bush, runs for president and he wins. Mr. Resume, as he is known as. Now, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein, whom we were allied with during the Iran Iraq War, we were supplying intelligence and also military material to Iraq to fight against Iran. Saddam Hussein, who is the dictator of Iraq, he meets with April Gillespie, who is a bureaucrat and the ambassador to Iraq, the Republican ambassador appointed by George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush to Iraq as the ambassador. He requests a meeting with April Gillespie, and he wants to know what the U.S. Feels, how the U.S. feels about Kuwait, and he wants help with resolving an issue with Kuwait and Iraq. Iraq views Kuwait as its rogue province, and Saddam Hussein has plans of bringing Iraq or bringing Kuwait back under the Iraqi order. Now, you have two different types of Arabs in this region. Iraqis, more northern Iraqis, they are more traditional Arabs, where Kuwaitis are more Gulf Arabs. And you have two distinct cultures, and they are quite different. But Saddam Hussein, like I say, he sees Kuwait and Kuwait's oil wealth as his, and he meets with April Gillespie to sort of gauge her reaction. He kind of dances around an open idea of a border dispute with Kuwait, and Gillespie utters a very famous phrase. She says, "Well, the U.S. doesn't really have any interest in a border skirmish between you and Kuwait, Mr. Hussein, and I don't think we really have that much of an interest in that." Well, that phrase is interpreted by Saddam Hussein as a green light to invade Kuwait, which we have an agreement with to protect in the case of they're a staunch ally of ours, and we have an agreement with them to protect them in this case. He views that as a green light to invade, and he invades Kuwait and pretty soon puts Kuwait under his boot. Now, Iraq had been our ally, as I said, during the 80s, and we had already equipped them with a, a ton, just an absolute arsenal of military supplies. We had made their army basically the fourth largest army in the world. But Kuwait was a major supplier of oil to not only the US, but also to Europe. And this was critical because Kuwait basically supplied the majority of the oil, and their port facilities supplied oil to Western Europe to keep the economy of Western Europe running. And many saw, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and Kuwait is right basically next door to Saudi Arabia, and Iraq is right next door to Saudi Arabia. A lot of military historians and foreign people that study foreign relations saw this invasion as step one to basically control Saudi Arabia and to also control the world's oil supply. The United States, at this point, George Bush very, very sternly says when Iraq invades Kuwait, the invasion of Kuwait will not stand. And we coordinate with Saudi Arabia to send 500,000 American troops in Operation Desert Storm or Desert Shield. Now, it starts out as Desert Shield. And the Soviet Union at this point, they can't respond. They basically back off. They say, okay. But Bush does something very clever. He works the phones and he builds a very impressive diplomatic coalition with the UN. And we, in turn, issue an ultimatum to Iraq. You either leave Kuwait by January 15th, 1991, or face full out war. And of course, Saddam Hussein flips us the bird, and they do not leave Kuwait. Now, that night, Operation Desert Storm begins with an air war. The United States bombs Iraq for several weeks, often sending over 2,500 sorties of attack aircraft per day. Iraq responds with Scud missiles attacking Saudi Arabia and Israel. I was in Saudi Arabia at this time, and I can tell you that we got rained on with Scud missiles at our base quite frequently. And it actually was somewhat unnerving. After a while, you get used to it, but it was unnerving because it was very hot there. You have to get into full mop gear, and it can be very disconcerting. But as a soldier, you're resigned to your fate and you do what you have to do. But Iraq responds with these Scuds, but the rest of the Arab world starts to get into our corner and they start to oppose Iraq. Slowly but surely, we're forcing Iraq into a position of compliance. February 24th, we launched the ground war, and within 100 hours, Iraqi forces are basically driven out of Kuwait. With overwhelming superiority, the U.S. led coalition defeats the Iraqi army. The U.S. in turn moves into Iraq, and as we are moving into Iraq to fight their army all the way back to Baghdad, Iraq demolishes oil wells in Kuwait. Now we were poised at this point to conquer all of Iraq. We had forces in the north. We had allies in the Kurds, which Saddam Hussein would later go on to use chemical weapons against. But we had allies in the north. And we had forces in the south, and we were ready to basically mop up Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power. Now, the decision was take out Saddam Hussein or leave him behind. Now, the politicians come to the conclusion that it made more sense to leave Saddam Hussein in place, that we perhaps had taught him a lesson and that he might now play ball. Nothing would be further from the truth, as we will all learn later. Casualties during the Iraq War: nearly 35,000 Iraqis are killed, over 75,000 are wounded. Thousands of tanks, artillery, and vehicles, hundreds of airplanes, hundreds of ships. The U.S. coalition suffers remarkably 147 killed. 145 would wind up dying of heat exposure. That is remarkable. Once again, we have the TV war. We have a war where you have embedded journalists, and this is a war that is brought into the American living room via TV nonstop. People are glued to their sets as they are watching this TV, as they're watching the TV and watching this war unfold in real time often. So, the first president of the new millennium. Now, George Bush, at this point, after this stunning victory in the Gulf War, he seems untouchable. Okay, he is an experienced politician. He's a war hero of World War II. He's a strong military leader. But once again, the economy and the broken promises that read my lips, no new taxes, they lead to the weakening of his presidency as the recession starts to fold in on him. Okay, and this leads to an advantage for his challenger, Bill Clinton, who is the young and up and coming Democrat governor of Arkansas. Now, Bill Clinton has no experience in federal government. He runs a small state, no military service. He purposefully avoided military service by dodging the draft, by using a college deferment and waiting until the draft was over before He wrote a letter to the commander of the ROTC at Arkansas State University or University of Arkansas, I believe, and basically mocking the military. And he also very famously, when he asked if he had ever smoked marijuana, he said yes, he did try marijuana, but he smoked it, but he never inhaled. It was sort of a way of, I guess, saying, yeah, I did it, but I never inhaled. I think we all know he probably did inhale. Uh, his brother Roger would go on to later say that when it came to Bill Clinton and cocaine, he had a nose like a Hoover. But and that's another lecture for another day. So Clinton's slogan, crafted by political strategist James Carville, was "It's the economy, stupid," because at the end of the Gulf War, George H.W. Bush had an 80% approval rating. All right, as the Gulf War fades into the distance, into the rearview mirror. The economy starts to dip after the war. It isn't so much now about this stellar president who has an impressive resume. It's about the economy, and people respond to that. The young president picks an equally young senator, Albert Gore Jr. from Tennessee, who's a good-looking guy to be his vice president. Suddenly, you have youth and vigor versus age and experience. And often America looks for youth and vigor. Now, Bush also, during this election campaign, he faces a challenge from Texan Ross Perot as a third party candidate. And this is where you start to see what I would argue is the beginning of the Trump movement because Ross Perot, who is a billionaire, he calls to attention the problem with the national debt. And he was the most successful third party nominee since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, but he would also be the most successful, I think, in sort of insurgent candidate until Donald Trump later on. So Perot does one thing, he causes that bifurcation between Republicans to divide. The more conservative Republicans who are concerned about the national debt and concerned about leading the country back to greatness and reducing big government, he basically divides the Republican Party and he siphons off enough votes or makes enough Republicans mad to basically allow Clinton to win with only 43% of the popular vote. Bush had 38%, and Perot pulled away with 19. Now, if you would have given Bush that 19%, he would have won handily. But Perot later stated that his intention was to revitalize the Democratic Party. Why, I don't know, but anyway, it's moot point now. But Perot goes on to basically be spoiler. Clinton wins the presidency, and we progress to the Clinton presidency. So the first baby boomer to win the White House. This is what the country looked like in 1982. The blue reflects Democrat, the red reflects solidly Republican. Clinton is able to pull in his home state of Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, the Rust Belt, New York. Bush holds on to Virginia, which at this point was solidly Republican, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, of course, all the way up north. And then, of course, out west, Clinton is able to get California's 54 electoral votes, which are critical to his victory. Now, politically, this is also where you start to see California begin to shift away from its conservative roots. California now is starting to turn solidly blue. All right, Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001. Bill Clinton is young, he is idealistic. Right? He is also a man with a lot of flaws. There are rumors about him being, for lack of a better term, a sexual pervert. and some of these things would come back to haunt him. But let's go into it. Let's talk about. He was also the first president to be the second president to be officially impeached, other than Andrew Johnson. Okay, President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came from a poor Arkansas background. He was a Rhodes Scholar, a very smart guy, but he attends Yale Law School. And while he's in Yale Law School, he meets a young and kind of nerdy, idealistic girl named Hillary Rodham, who is the daughter of a very wealthy Illinois family. And in 1992, they follow on and they get married. And Bill Clinton, in the late 80s, becomes the governor of Arkansas. Okay, in 1992, he runs for president against George W. Bush, as I said, with Ross Perot running as an independent. Now, with the Rodney King riots in LA, with the recession, Americans had believed that Bush basically hadn't done enough. And Ross Perot comes in, he splits the vote. Ross Perot's third party candidate drive was basically his candidacy was one of the most successful, drink here, in American history. All right, so Clinton's domestic policy. Let's talk about his domestic policy. Clinton cut federal spending, okay, raised taxes on the rich, and he lowered taxes on the poorest Americans. Now, Clinton also proposed health care reforms. Okay, the health care that we have now, Obamacare, this was originally proposed during the Clinton administration, but he failed to get them passed into law. And what's interesting is that healthcare failed primarily because it was spearheaded by his wife, Hillary Clinton, who Hillary Clinton, who would be questioned as not somebody who had the proper authority or power to push through government policy. This was not traditionally the role of the First Lady. And as such, politically, this galvanized the opposition against Bill Clinton. And in so doing, healthcare failed. But now, the end of the Cold War saw our national debt drop because the peace benefit, the peace benefit of not having the Soviet Union as our enemy, was that we could take this huge military industrial infrastructure and we could start to shutter it. A lot of military bases that had been in existence in America for decades were now being closed and shuttered. Mare Island Naval Station, Treasure Island Naval Station, Alameda in the Bay Area of California, George Air Force Base, which is a base I was stationed at for a long time. A lot of these bases, especially bases in Europe, bases in Germany that were the front lines against a potential Russian invasion, were now being shuttered because we simply did not need them anymore. And what Clinton did, he basically used this money to his advantage, and he used it to reduce the national debt. Now, there are those that will argue that he was forced to do this because Clinton did during the midterms of his first uh, term, during the midterms, he did lose his majority in the Congress and Senate. We're going to talk about that in a minute with Newt Gingrich and the Republicans, and they forced Clinton's hand to start to reduce the budget deficit. But the economy starts to prosper as we start to reallocate these funds, and employment goes down, consumer spending starts to increase, and business profits were basically at all-time highs. And when you, especially in the computer industry, you start to have the development of the tech industry. This is where the tech industry, this is the birth of the tech industry. The big tech oligarchs that you see, like Bill Gates, people like that. These, I mean, when Mark Zuckerberg was in Harvard, I mean, here he's still in high school. He goes to Harvard later, but Bill Gates, Microsoft, the rise of the personal computer, the market that the personal computer is eventually brought forth, Steve Jobs. These are all things that start to drive the economy. And as such, business profits being at an all time high, Tax revenues were at an all time high as well. And so, what we have, though, is political polarization. Clinton's presidency, like I said, his promise was a major plan to overhaul healthcare. Now, I'm a firm believer that the government should stay out of things like healthcare. My healthcare, I have a combination of healthcare with the healthcare that I get through the school and through the VA. And I would much rather have independent healthcare because I've been to the VA, and the VA, while it's decent, I just don't know if I'd ever want to have surgery there. Because if you let the government run anything, like I said, efficiency is not a government hallmark, and inefficiency is going to breed complacency, and it's going to breed not only waste but it's going to breed uh, dysfunction in any system. And you see this. And so to allow the government to take over healthcare is going to lead to cost increases as it is now. And it's going to lead to a system that is not going to be able to produce a product that will give you what you need in the end. All right. So high cost for medical insurance at this point, they lead over 20 million Americans to not have coverage. Now, Hillary Clinton, she leads a committee to create a plan to limit costs and insure each citizen, but it became controversial because they were calling it Hillary Care. And it is branded as socialism by Reagan style conservatives. And the bill fails, even with Democrat control in Congress, because Bill Clinton, he comes out initially as a sort of proto socialist. Even though he's very wildly popular, he's a proto socialist. And in response, what the Republicans do during the 1994 midterm elections, Newt Gingrich comes out with a very popular slogan. He basically says, here's a list of 10 promises the Republicans they would pursue if they win the majority in Congress that they have not had since 1954. And Gingrich comes out, he's an insurgent candidate, and he comes out and they win a broad margin in not only the Congress, but the Senate. And they use this as a hedge against Bill Clinton. Now, Clinton pledges to try and work with the opposition, okay? But Clinton has to reevaluate his position here, and he has to rethink his options. Because in the election, he basically gets his head handed to him, and he knows he can't enact his socialist agenda now. So what you have is a polarization of red versus blue. The country quickly becomes divided along the lines of conservative versus liberal, Republican versus Democrat. Now, what do we have today? History doesn't repeat itself, ladies and gentlemen. It rhymes. Very good. Okay, ironically, the constant debates and the problems between Republicans and Democrats, they lead to cuts in spending because Clinton has to rethink his strategy here. Okay, and he starts calling himself, quote unquote, a new Democrat. I'm a new Democrat. The era of big government is over, says Clinton. And the United States, because he does adopt conservative policies, especially in the budget deficits and relating to budgets, the federal budget, the actual budget surplus is applied to the deficit and the deficit starts to shrink. The US government is heading towards the black. We've been in the red for years because of the Cold War. Now we're headed into the black, the Cold War and the New Deal. Okay, so the economy begins to recover. Okay, and by the midterm election, or by the election, I'm sorry, his second term in 1996, the Republicans, they run an old war horse against Clinton, and he's popular again. They run an old war horse, Bob Dole, and Bob Dole is, while he's a very admirable man and a good senator and a good soldier, he was a World War II hero. Clinton is basically reelected for a second term. Now, but in 1998, problems start to arise. Clinton nearly loses his presidency due to a scandal. Now, during his first term, it was reported that Clinton had engaged in a sexual affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky was a young girl that was just barely a few years older than Clinton's young daughter, Chelsea. And she was also, what's really interesting, if we're just going to get into the weeds on this for a minute, Monica Lewinsky was clearly somebody who was a disturbed young girl who did some very improper things in the White House. Uh, she would flirt with Bill Clinton. She even flashed her panties at him once. And this prompted Clinton to make a move on her. At this point, they have repeated sexual contact, even in the Oval Office. I will not go into detail. You can read about the detail on your own, or you can Google Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton scandal on YouTube, and you can watch it for yourself. I will forewarn you, you're going to need to take a shower after you hear some of that stuff because it's, like I say, it's very lewd. However, I will skip over this and move on. But what occurs, what my thinking is, and like I say, working in the White House, you have to go through a tremendous background check. I mean, they know, they go and they talk to everyone in your past. They find out the least little things that might keep you, because you're around sensitive information and you're around very important people and in your job, and you have to be trustworthy, and you have to not be someone who will do something like flash the president. Okay, and I don't know how Monica Lewinsky ever got past the background check, but she did. And anyway, I'll move on because I don't want to get too far into the weeds there. But problem is that Clinton asked people whenever this started to come to the forefront, and this is made public when Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp, her co-worker in the White House, when this scandal is made public, uh, Clinton tries to pressure people into lying. Now, initially, Clinton comes out and says, very famously, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky, and I need to go back to work for the people of my district or people of this country." Yeah, the people of this country. All right, and that he famously says this on TV with his wife standing right beside him, and it was a lie. He did. All right, so outraged Republicans at this point because Clinton is deposed in a lawsuit and he allegedly he lies. He tries to have it both ways. If you remember from earlier, oh yeah, I smoked, but I didn't inhale. Clinton tries to debate in this deposition about the definition of the word is. What do you think the word is means? And the guys on the opposite side of the table who are deposing him think they have him in a lie. And outraged Republicans demand impeachment. Now, voting falls along party lines with Republicans impeaching the president, but they lack the two-thirds majority that they need to remove him from office. He is, however, uh, he faces this major scandal, and impeachment basically removes that they have to remove him from office. The Senate holds a trial requiring a two-thirds vote to convict. They are not successful. However, it is proven that Clinton did lie under oath. Now, this is interesting because even though he is not removed from office, Clinton tries to spin this and he spins it this way. Well, hey, it's my private life. All right. Look, hey, I got problems just like everybody else. But look, here's the reality. Clinton's a horn dog, okay? And he has a proven track record of not only misogyny, but he has a proven track record of incidents involving women, even dating back to his days as the governor of Arkansas. And all of this comes out. And when this does come out, it proves to be very detrimental to his presidency. But he is impeached, but he is not removed from office. But because he is impeached, okay, it is proven that he does lie under oath and he does have to face consequences. As such, he loses his law license later as a penalty. So the public, though, however, once again fails to basically have confidence in their leaders. We have another scandal at the 6 year point of another administration that leads to a lack of confidence between the American people and their president. So now, Clinton's foreign policy was actually very intriguing. As we mentioned earlier, things start to heat up in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, former Soviet republic. You have the ethnic makeup, Bosnian Serbs uh, and Muslim Croats. And you have the end of the Cold War. There is no Soviet Union to keep these people separated, and Christian Serbs attempt to massacre. They massacre the Bosnian Muslims living in Kosovo in an attempt to ethnically cleanse this region. Now, fearing a genocide, just like the Holocaust, President Clinton sends U.S. troops into uh, Yugoslavia, and he uses NATO airstrikes to stop the Serbians from attacking Kosovo. And this is actually a very successful war. And it basically achieves this accomplishment. He basically stops this genocide, and he should get kudos for that. He does. Now, President Clinton pushes through NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, much to the chagrin of his former political opponent, Ross Perot, who famously says, if you hear that giant sucking sound, that will be all of your jobs headed to Mexico. But NAFTA is turns out to be a decent thing for the country because basically what it does, it removes trade barriers that are in place between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., and it creates an economic zone which allows for good economic progress and good economic times in the country. Some say that it causes a loss of jobs, like Ross Perot. He says that because it allows other nations to lower wages. There are fewer government regulations, but it does improve the economy. The U.S. also joins the GATT agreement, which is a worldwide trade organization which increases world trade and creates a more global economy. So let's talk about the information age and cultural diffusion. Now, personal computers are on the rise at this point. I think I got my first personal computer in, I think, 1994. But in the 1990s, you have this new thing called the internet. And the internet is quite fascinating. It was invented in the 1970s by the U.S. military, and it was basically only usable by the military until 1984. And what it was an interconnected system to where if you're at one base, you could communicate with another base, or if you're at Lawrence Livermore Labs, for example, you could communicate with other scientists in your network. We called it the interwebs. And the development of fiber optic cables, though, would lead for the faster transfer of information. As I mentioned earlier, the rise of the information age and the cresting, that wave is starting to push up, where you have the information age starting to overtake the old manufacturing economy and leave it behind. But this allows the World Wide Web, fiber optic cables and laying them, and satellites as well, allow for the development of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s. And a new industry is born. You have early internet development, early computer technology development, led by people like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak. Jobs and Wozniak found Apple. Gates founds Microsoft, and the world rapidly becomes increasingly connected. Okay. Now the advance in this e-commerce increasingly helps those who are financially well off, but it does not help the third world because the third world still lags behind. So these entrepreneurs start to come to the forefront. An entrepreneur is someone who takes the risks of starting a business in the hopes of making a profit. Very sound economic principle there. These are some of the entrepreneurs that become very prominent in the 1990s. Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft; Steve Jobs, Apple; Sam Walton, he founds Walmart, and with Bill Clinton's help, mind you, Walmart goes national. Robert Johnson, who is the African American founder of BET; Lionel Sosa, who is a Hispanic advertising genius. All right. So the new millennium dawns, and you have the country in the year 2000, the pendulum, after years of Bill Clinton, the country is fairly content with Bill Clinton, but with all of the scandals and with some very noticeable gaffes by Bill Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, who very, I think, humorly, very funnily claims. I mean, it's hard to imagine this. Claims that he invented the internet. People see Gore as kind of an odd duck. They see him as being somewhat narcissistic, and they tend to opt for the down home folksism and folksy approach of George W. Bush, who is a very popular governor of the state of Texas. And once again, the son of the Bush family, the scion of the Bush family, and he has the backing of the Republican Party. And as the 2000 election looms, we have a dramatic election once again, very similar to 1960. Bush winds up with 50.5% of the electoral vote to Al Gore's 49.5%. Uh, Ralph Nader shaves off a very slight percentage of those votes in the popular vote, which leads to a 47.9% of the popular vote for Bush, 48.4 for Gore. This is a razor thin election. On election night, my wife and I were sitting in our home in California, not quite sure how this thing was going to go because no one had conceded. Bush claims victory. Gore calls him, and he does what he thinks is a concession. But Gore calls him and basically says, I don't think you and your brother, who at that point in time is the governor of Florida, should be the deciding factor in this election. And he promises to fight, and the election gets thrown into the courts. What this winds up doing, it's too close to call, but multiple recounts start to occur, and Bush is initially in the lead. But as these recounts occur, Bush questions about Bush's lead start to come to the forefront. Back then, there were no voting machines. You had to vote on a ballot. There was a ballot, and you had chads. If you punched the chad for your candidate, that's and it was fed into the machine. It would read if it was noticed that you punched for the candidate, they would put it into a reader, and that reader would tell you who the vote was cast for. Now, the Supreme Court, Gore challenges this, and basically hanging chads, swinging chads, dimpled chads, pregnant chads, all of these things start to come to the forefront, and we start to learn more about the electoral process than we've ever learned before. Well, what occurs is that Gore challenges this in the Supreme Courts, and in the courts, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they determine that the election is complete and that George Bush wins outright. Now, this creates a huge deal of controversy in that they see that the election, or the impression that the election is settled in the courts as opposed to the ballot box, goes on to haunt Bush for some years later. But Bush runs on a platform of compassionate conservatism. The impression of conservatives being mean spirited and not for the little guy, he tries to change this. He campaigns as a pro family values conservative Christian candidate. He enters the presidency with basically plans for economic and educational reforms. What he wants to do is focus on domestic issues. That is his main focus. No child left behind. He wants to focus on reforming American society for the good. However, on that morning, as we all know, our life was forever altered. September 11th, 2001, and the War on Terror. Now, George Bush's presidency goes from wanting to be an election president to very quickly, winding up on a wartime footing. There is a massive attack on U.S. soil. that is perpetrated by a terrorist group named Al Qaeda, which is led by a former Mujahideen uh, fighter in Afghanistan, the son of a wealthy Saudi family named Osama bin Laden. Through nefarious means, they are able to commandeer airliners, which we all know. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. You're familiar with this. And they fly these airliners into the Pentagon and to the World Trade Center. Uh, 3,000 people are killed, more than 6,000 others wounded. This leads to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which would begin a nearly 20-year war. Now, the United States begins the war on terror, which I was dramatically involved in. And the pledge there was to root out and destroy all supporters of terrorism. Now, we were concerned primarily that Iraq's dictator was supporting terrorists, and there is ample proof to prove that. Saddam Hussein, he supports terrorists. He possesses weapons of mass destruction. During the Clinton presidency, Saddam Hussein gasses the Kurds, which are an ethnic minority in the north of Iraq, and the United States believes that it is important to remove Saddam Hussein because he is too much of a wild card. You could argue that we should have removed him in 91, but that's neither here nor there. What we do, we invade the country in 2003. I was part of that. And it, we eventually wind up capturing Hussein, but we don't find any weapons of mass destruction. And this destabilizes the entire region. Now, Iraq is actually more stable than Afghanistan, which we would later go to fight in. And we have since then pulled out of Afghanistan very surreptitiously. We could argue the merits of that later, but I am going to move on. So, the war on terror. So, the Department of Homeland Security is founded to create terrorism. They adopt the Patriot Act, which basically allows the government to collect metadata on your cell phones. I was also involved in looking at that early on as a force protection person and someone that had access to that information. Okay, and but what the objective of that was to try and create uh, an arm of the government to give the government power to find terrorists to keep Americans safe. Unfortunately, when you give the government that much power, they tend to abuse it, and they have abused it. Critics say that it violates the rights of Americans as it spies on them. Now, in this day and age, it's hard to tell what is spying and what is prudence when it comes to homeland security. I'll let you debate that later. But Afghanistan, the Taliban were basically ousted in the first month. Okay, but they continued fighting an insurgency for more over a decade. We killed Osama bin Laden in 2011 in Iraq, 2002 to 2011. Saddam Hussein was ousted. Uh, in both wars, there is no easy exit strategy. What follows is chaos and instability, which allows extremist groups like ISIS to take root in the Middle East. And this is where the USA they do a couple of things that, and I've told you this before, guys. We're very good at killing people and breaking things in wartime, but we're not so good at winning the peace. The only exception being the Marshall Plan. There is no Marshall Plan for Iraq and Afghanistan, and what this does, this leads to instability and this leads to problems that will, I think, further haunt us later on. Okay, so Hurricane Katrina during the Bush administration, Hurricane Katrina becomes a major thorn in the side of George W. Bush. Now, the New Orleans levee system fails. It was poorly built to begin with, but it fails to protect New Orleans. Hundreds of people die, thousands lose their homes, millions of lives are disrupted and damaged. George Bush is seen as the president that is failed to respond to this. But realistically, under the 14th Amendment, the states have the power, or the states are specifically responsible for responding to natural disasters. The feds are the ones that are supposed to come in and take the brunt of the rebuild the states, after the states give them permission to do so. George Bush had requested uh, from the governor of New Orleans permission to allow the feds to come in to Louisiana and to New Orleans to help. She refused, and the federal government's hands were tied. And George Bush, unfortunately, had to take the fall for this. And he did look terrible in that. Now, the Great Recession and the election of 2008. Now, in 2007, you had a perfect storm of financial proportions where large banking corporations start to begin to lose money in the subprime mortgage crisis. Subprime mortgages are basically Ponzi schemes where they offer you a mortgage that is several points below the prime interest rate. At this point, it was at about 7%. And what they would do, they would offer a subprime mortgage that would start you out at 2 or 3%, and then year by year, it would build up and get to the rate of 7%. And what they did, they offered these loans to lower income buyers in the hopes they're gambling on the fact that the economy will improve and that these buyers will, their wages will increase and they will be able to offset that rise in cost. Well, it does not work out that way because the economy starts to fall into recession. And you have 1.5, well over $2 trillion of risky loans that are out there. And all of these loans start to default. Now, this creates an effect where basically it locks down the financial system. No one wants to loan any money. And then it has a worldwide effect because these bonds that are packaged in these subprime mortgages are sold overseas as investments. Once those bonds start to default, this creates shock and panic all across the financial systems of the world. And it basically shocks and decreases the money supply. People start shutting down, and there's no money in the system. Uh, Lending stops virtually at this point. There's no lending going on. And this housing crisis is also followed by automobile manufacturers like GM, who are starting to fail because no one's buying cars. Economic woes start to lead to stagnation, which leads to an economic recession that is blamed on George W. Bush. The final midterm of his presidency, he loses his majority in the Congress and the Senate that he had held since 2000. And citizens basically are growing tired of the wars in the Middle East. No weapons of mass destruction were found. Actually, I can argue that they were found. I've got some inside baseball info on that. If you want to know about that, come to me and talk to me about it, and we can talk about it off record. But nonetheless, the U.S. society looks ripe for another Democrat to step up to the plate, a candidate that says, yes, we can, and a candidate for change. And that candidate would be Barack Obama. And here's what the country looks like in 2008. And hope comes back. The first African American president, Barack Obama. Now, like Clinton and Bush, Obama was highly partisan. He was beloved by his party because he was the first African American to run. But he was actually hated by the other side. They didn't like him because he very much was a socialist. And Obama wanted to change the very fabric of American society and turn America into a socialist nation. Now, he ended the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but what he was criticized for was leaving behind unstable countries. We still had a force in Afghanistan because it was politically expedient to stay there, but we basically backed off in Afghanistan and allowed our gains in Afghanistan to be negated. Now, Obama did offer major social reform, healthcare, immigration reform. He didn't. He failed in getting immigration reform passed. That's still a problem, but he succeeds along partisan lines in getting health care passed, and we have Obamacare now because of that. It also leads to increased numbers of illegal immigration and legal immigration to the U.S. So, some topics to consider here: cultural diffusion. You have a rise in robotics. which means to a displacement of jobs. Laissez-faire, uh, you have civic responsibilities, uh, global warming, Hillary Clinton, illegal immigration. These would all lead to the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. And I'll just be quite frank with you, there's not a whole lot about Trump on the STAR test, I think. So I'm not going to go in to the Trump administration and all the stuff we've seen since then. Perhaps later we'll talk about that. But that pretty much at this point is it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are done with the lectures. I want to thank you for listening, and I will see you guys next week. Hopefully, I'll have these guys up. And my wife looks like she is ready to go. She is glowering at me. She wants to go have dinner. So we'll see you guys next week. And it's been a fun ride.